The war had settled into something ugly. What had once been an empire of absolute control had now become a fractured nation, with two sides fighting tooth and nail over a landscape that had once belonged to both of them. The front stretched for miles, cutting through what was once the heartland of America. Cities were no longer cities, they were husks, battlefields, and death traps where neither side could hold ground for long. Every night, tracer rounds lit up the sky, and every morning, the bodies were cleared, only for more to fall the next day. For years, the war had been fought in chaos, in bursts of destruction, but now it had settled into something much worse. Stagnation. The trenches carved into the land were deep, fortified with steel, with heavy artillery, with automated turrets that fired at anything that moved. Drones hovered over no man's land, scanning the ruins for any sign of movement, but they were often unreliable. Too many bodies, too much wreckage, too much static interference from the wreckage of once proud cities. For the first time in centuries, war had reached a point where neither side could move. The rebels had the will to fight, but the government still held its technological edge. Supremacy had slipped from its grasp, but that did not make them weak. The West was still a fortress, and with every failed push into enemy territory, the rebels were reminded that the government still had the world's most dangerous arsenal at its disposal. The undead had become less of a threat, but the new monstrosities they had begun creating in the labs hidden beneath the deserts of Texas and New Mexico, those were something else entirely. The government was playing its last hand, experimenting with horrors that should have never existed, doing anything to regain the upper hand. But even with all of their experiments, even with the trenches turning into graveyards, the people were still fighting. The rebels had suffered too much to turn back now. Every inch of land gained was held onto with desperation, and every mile the government forces lost sent another shockwave of doubt through their ranks. The president watched all of this from his underground sanctuary, deep beneath the earth, surrounded by the last remnants of his empire's old elite. He rarely slept. He rarely spoke. His eyes were locked on screens, on reports, on battle footage that all told him the same thing: this war was slipping away from him. He had never known fear until the Duke of Lancaster County had stood in his office, smiling in the dark. Since that night, he had become something else. He had always ruled through absolute authority, but now he ruled through paranoia. He barely trusted his generals, his advisors, or even the officers stationed outside his own bunker. He had seen the fear spreading through his ranks, seen the cracks forming in the loyalty of his once unshakable forces. And the worst part, the thing that kept him awake at night, the Duke was still out there. No matter what defenses were put in place, no matter how many patrols were sent after him, no matter how many traps were set, he was still out there, still striking, still bleeding the government dry. The president had lost track of how many high-ranking officers had been found dead in their quarters, how many facilities had been raided and reduced to cinders, How many classified projects had been dismantled by a ghost that could not be caught? But it wasn't just him anymore. The Duke had become something far beyond a man. He was an idea now, a legend whispered across the battlefield, a name that could shake even the most hardened soldiers. He was the one thing the rebels and the people could hold onto, the one thing the government could not suppress. He had shown the world that the undead empire could bleed, that it could be torn apart. And now, he was planning something bigger. Something final. Deep within the trenches, among the soldiers who still fought for freedom, a plan was beginning to take shape. The war had dragged on long enough. The stalemate had cost too many lives, had wasted too much time. There would be no future if this conflict did not end soon. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let it spiral into another century of endless fighting. And so, in the dark corners of the rebellion's hidden strongholds, maps were laid out. Supply lines were studied. Enemy patterns were analyzed. Everything the government still held, everything that could still be used against them, was accounted for. The plan was simple. If they wanted to win, they couldn't just take land. They couldn't just push the government back mile by mile. They had to end it. There was only one target that mattered. The president. Wherever he was, wherever his fortress had been built, it had to be destroyed. And so, for the first time in years, the war shifted again. Not into another brutal exchange of trench warfare, not into another slow, grinding battle of attrition. This was something else. This was the beginning of the end. The government threw everything they had into figuring out who he was. Every intelligence officer, every surveillance system, every classified database was scoured for any information, any clue that could help them understand the Duke of Lancaster County. They had dismissed him as a myth at first, a story told by desperate rebels to keep morale alive. But after too many dead officers, too many high-security locations reduced to rubble, after watching their forces panic at the mere rumor of his presence, they knew he was real. But the problem was, he wasn't supposed to exist. The first breakthrough came after weeks of investigation. A name Johnny Vanjik. Born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, long before the rebellion had even begun. That was all they could find. No school records, no employment history, no military service. It was as if he had appeared from nothing. But the truly disturbing part wasn't just his lack of history. It was what their deeper investigations uncovered. He had been spotted in multiple places at the same time. At first, they assumed it was a mistake. A trick of the mind. Maybe a well-trained group imitating him, or a network of rebels using his name as a symbol. But then they pulled the footage from multiple locations across the war zones. The timestamps were undeniable. He had been in 3 different cities on the same night. He had personally led an assault on a supply convoy in Tennessee, eliminating an entire squadron with surgical precision. At the exact same time, he had infiltrated a government compound in Kentucky, killing every high-ranking officer inside before disappearing into the night. And on that very same night, deep behind enemy lines, inside one of the most heavily fortified labs in New Mexico, he had been seen destroying years of research, setting fire to entire underground facilities filled with the government's most classified experiments. There was no way one man could be in all three places at once. Either there was more than one Johnny Vanjik, or, as the terrifying evidence began to suggest, time and space did not apply to him. And the worst part? It might be both. The scientists working for the government, those who had spent their lives unraveling the secrets of the undead, had no explanation for what they were seeing. He was always one step ahead. Always in the right place at the right time. It was as if he knew what they were going to do before they even made the decision. The president, already spiraling into paranoia, became obsessed. "What the hell is he?" he demanded. No one could answer. The only thing they knew for certain was that Johnny Vanjik was real. And he wasn't playing by the rules of reality. If there were more than one of him, that meant he could be anywhere, anytime. If time itself didn't apply to him, that meant he could see things before they happened. And if it was both, that meant he was something beyond human understanding. The government's greatest strength had always been fear. They had ruled the world because people believed they were untouchable, invincible, eternal. But now, they were afraid. Afraid of a man who didn't die. Afraid of a man who could be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Afraid of a force they could not control, could not kill, could not even comprehend. And that fear? It was spreading. The government had spent years trying to understand Johnny Vanjik. They had thrown every resource into tracking his movements, analyzing his methods, predicting his next target. And just when they thought they had at least some grasp on how he operated, he did something no one could have expected. He started setting the undead free. At first, they thought it was a mistake, or some kind of cruel psychological warfare. Government-controlled facilities, long used to contain and weaponize the undead, were being breached, but not destroyed. Instead, their containment fields were disabled, their chains undone, and the creatures that had been locked away for decades were suddenly unleashed. The first instance happened in what was once Louisiana, where the government had been keeping a horde of engineered undead in underground silos, waiting for the right moment to unleash them against the rebellion. One night, their security systems shut down without warning, and by the time the guards realized what was happening, every containment chamber was empty. But the creatures didn't attack the surrounding towns. They didn't move toward rebel-held territory. Instead, they headed west straight into government-controlled land. The next event happened in Missouri, where an entire experimental undead processing center was found burned to the ground, but every subject had been set loose beforehand. reports came in that packs of the undead were moving in coordinated patterns, targeting government supply lines, roaming through no man's land like predators hunting for their prey. The government's own weapons had been turned against them. And the worst part? Johnny wasn't just setting them loose. He was controlling them. There was footage grainy, captured through the dying lenses of security drones that showed a figure standing in the middle of a horde, untouched, unafraid. It was him. Johnny Vanjik, standing with the undead, walking among them as if they were his own personal army. In one clip, taken just outside of a collapsing government checkpoint in Kansas, he was seen standing before a massive engineered monstrosity, one of the government's latest creations, a fusion of multiple bodies stitched together into something that shouldn't exist. The creature snarled, roared, but didn't move. Johnny raised a hand. And the creature stopped. Not just stopped, it knelt. The footage cut out moments later, but the message was clear. The government had spent centuries believing they had control over the undead. They had weaponized them, studied them, enslaved them for their own gain. But now, Johnny was showing them that they were wrong. Because whatever connection they thought they had to the undead, his was stronger. The undead weren't turning on the rebels. They weren't following government commands anymore. They were following him. For the first time, the monsters that had built the empire of the dead had a new master. And the government? They were about to learn what it felt like to be on the other side of the nightmare. The government had always assumed the undead were nothing more than weapons, mindless husks to be unleashed and controlled, things to be used, discarded, and replaced when necessary. But they had never once stopped to consider something. Something terrifying. Something simple. Even the undead wanted freedom. For centuries, the creatures had been forced into service, their existence nothing more than a tool for an empire built on death. They had been trapped, shackled by chains, locked in containment fields, experimented on, harvested for their abilities, twisted into monstrosities far beyond what they had ever been in life. And yet, through all of it, they had remained obedient. Or at least, that's what the government had believed. The truth was far more horrifying. The undead hadn't been obedient. They had been trapped. Their bodies were bound, their movements restricted, but their minds were still there. The government had always assumed their hunger, their instincts, had erased whatever remained of the people they had once been. They had assumed wrong. Because for all those years, buried deep within rotting corpses, in stitched together abominations, in soldiers reanimated for war, something had been screaming. Something had been waiting. And when Johnny set them free, when he broke the chains that held them, when he walked among them and spoke with a voice that they could somehow understand, they listened. Because he wasn't just another human. He wasn't another master to enslave them, another tyrant to force them into battle. He was the first one to give them a choice. And for the first time since the world had been consumed by the dead, they chose. They chose to turn against the government. They chose to destroy the ones who had used them. They chose to be more than just puppets. They had been called monsters, beasts, weapons. But now, they were something else. And as the undead legions began to march not as slaves, but as an army with a cause the government finally understood. They had never truly controlled the undead. They had just been lucky that the dead hadn't figured out what they were capable of. But now they had. And now, they were free. For centuries, the undead had been used, tormented, controlled. But when Johnny Vanjik set them free, he did not promise them war. He did not promise them revenge. He promised them an end. The only condition he gave was simple: when the war was over, they would be cured. For the first time, the undead had a future. Not as weapons, not as monsters, not as tools of destruction, but as what they once were. People. No more forced servitude. No more being trapped in rotting flesh. No more shackles, no more chains, no more hunger. They would be given back their lives. And that was why they followed him. Not because he commanded them. Not because he controlled them. But because he was the only one who had ever looked at them and seen them for what they were. Not just the dead. Not just the damned. But the forgotten. The ones who had been left behind in an empire that had thrived on their suffering. The ones who had never been given a choice. Now, for the first time, they had one. And they chose Johnny Vanjik. Because he was the only one fighting for them, just as he was fighting for the living. And the government. They had no idea how to stop it. They had spent so long believing they were the only ones who could control the undead, the only ones who could command them, bend them to their will. Now, their own creations were marching against them. The cities that had once been fortresses of government control were falling one by one, and every time, the same horrifying thing happened. The undead were not attacking at random. They were not slaughtering indiscriminately. They were hunting government loyalists. They were ignoring rebels, ignoring civilians. They were targeting the very people who had created them, who had enslaved them, who had turned them into what they had become. And for the first time since the war began, the government realized something that shook them to their core. The undead were not just a weapon anymore. They were a rebellion of their own. And they were going to make sure this war ended. Because for them, this was not about conquest. It was not about victory. It was about breaking the cycle. Johnny had given them one promise, one hope. When this was over, they would be cured. And now, they were going to fight like hell to make sure that future happened. The government's greatest mistake had never been its obsession with control, nor its reliance on the undead. It had been its belief that control was the only way to rule. For centuries, The undead empire had bent wills. It had forced obedience, crushed rebellion, enslaved nations, and twisted the very laws of life and death to maintain its power. But Johnny Vanjik, he never forced anyone to fight for him. He never chained people to his cause. No. People followed him because they wanted to. Because he didn't demand loyalty, he earned it. The government had to threaten people into battle. It had to enslave the dead. It had to keep its forces in line with fear, with brutality, with the constant looming threat that if they turned against their masters, they would be wiped out. But Johnny didn't need to rule by fear. He didn't need to bend wills, because people followed him willingly. The rebels fought not because they had no choice, but because they believed in something greater than themselves. The undead followed not because they were ordered to, but because for the first time in history, someone had given them the chance to be something more. And that was why the government was losing. They could keep throwing armies at Johnny. They could keep creating new weapons, designing new horrors, trying to outthink a man who did not play by the same rules as the rest of them. But none of it mattered. Because every person they tried to break, every soldier they forced into battle, every undead creation they sent into the field, had a choice now. And more, they were choosing Vanjik. And in the shadows of his failing empire, deep in the bunkers where his loyalists whispered in fear, the president finally understood. The war was not going to be won by who had the most weapons, the most soldiers, or the most control. It was going to be won by who the people believed in. And they did not believe in him anymore. They believed in Johnny Vanjik. And that was something he could never control. That was the part that drove the government insane. Johnny Vanjik wasn't doing this for power. He wasn't trying to rule anything. He wasn't building a new empire, wasn't demanding loyalty in exchange for favors, wasn't carving his own kingdom out of the ashes of the old world. No. When this war was over, when the government was gone, when the undead were cured, when the world had finally freed itself from centuries of oppression, Johnny was just going to go home. That was the real joke. That was the part the president couldn't comprehend, the part his generals refused to believe. Johnny wasn't fighting because he wanted to be a hero. He wasn't fighting because he wanted revenge. He wasn't fighting because he wanted a legacy. He was fighting because it needed to be done. Because Lancaster should have never been touched. Had they left it alone, had they never enslaved its people, never tried to bend it to their will, never pushed it into the dirt as an example to the rest of the country, they would have never met Johnny Vanjik. And that was their greatest mistake. Because he didn't come looking for war. They brought it to him. And now, he was just finishing it. No crown. No throne. No speeches about how he had saved the world. Just the same man he always was. When the war ended, he wouldn't be sitting at a table, writing treaties, or making laws. he'd be walking back into Lancaster County. Maybe going back to whatever work he used to do. Maybe finding a quiet spot to sit, a drink to have, a place to rest. And that was the part that terrified the government the most. Because they had spent centuries believing that power was the only thing that mattered. But Johnny, he had never cared about power. And that made him the most unstoppable force they had ever encountered. The sky was burning. Explosions lit up the horizon as the final battle began, casting shadows over the last remnants of an empire that had ruled the world for far too long. The trenches, the ruined cities, the fortified bunkers buried deep beneath the earth, none of it mattered anymore. Because tonight, Johnny Vanjik was going to kill them all. The government had retreated as far as they could go, pulling what was left of their forces into the last strongholds of the undead empire. Their final fortress, deep beneath the deserts of Texas, was the most heavily guarded location on the planet. Thousands of soldiers stood between Johnny and the president. They had their most advanced weapons, their most horrific creations, their final desperate attempts to hold onto control. And Johnny, he had a .44 Magnum and a grudge. He moved through the battlefield like a ghost, untouched by the chaos around him, the world bending in ways it wasn't supposed to bend whenever he stepped forward. Bullets missed. Explosions tore through the ground, but never touched him. Every time a soldier tried to react, they were already too late. Because Johnny Vanjik didn't exist by the rules of time and space. He was already where he needed to be before they could even understand what was happening. They had spent years trying to kill him, trying to break him, trying to understand what he was. But they had never once stopped to ask what he wanted. And what he wanted was very simple. No more undead. No more empire. No more control. They had burned his home. They had enslaved his people. They had created the war they thought they could win. And now, as the flames consumed the last of their world, they finally understood. They were never going to win. Because Johnny Vanjik was going to kill them all. One by one. And by morning, the undead empire would be nothing but ash. The final fortress of the undead empire stretched deep beneath the Texas desert, a massive underground city of steel and concrete where the last remnants of the government had buried themselves, hoping to outlast the inevitable. The surface was a wasteland of fire, bombed-out bunkers, and shattered war machines littering the battlefield. The trenches had long since been abandoned, the last strongholds of the government's once mighty military falling like dominoes in the wake of the rebellion. The rebels had pushed them back, inch by inch, state by state, until there was nowhere left to run. And now, deep beneath the earth, the president sat in a cold, dark war room, surrounded by what little remained of his advisors. The walls shook as another explosion ripped through the upper levels. Reports from the last of the surface garrisons had gone silent hours ago. Communications were breaking down. The automated defense drones that had once patrolled the halls were no longer responding. Because Johnny was here. The last and greatest mistake of the government had arrived at their doorstep. And he wasn't going to stop. The slaughter begins. It started at level 10, deep within the underground base, where the outer security teams had been waiting for him. They had prepared for his arrival, lined the corridors with automated turrets, filled the halls with shock troops in mechanized exosuites, the best of what remained. And still, it didn't matter. The first sign of his presence was a flicker in the security feeds. The next, the power went out. Not just the lights, but the weapons, the defenses, everything connected to the base's network. Then, the gunfire started. It was brief, violent, and one-sided. The security forces didn't have time to react. They opened fire on nothing, their bullets ripping through empty air. And then he was among them. One man. One gun. He moved too fast, too precise, as if he had seen every possible outcome of this fight before it even happened. The first 5 guards dropped before they could even process what was happening. The next 10 tried to run, but Johnny was already ahead of them. It was merciless. He tore through wave after wave of elite soldiers, men, and women who had trained their entire lives for warfare in the dead Empire's name. And they didn't stand a chance. The survivors tried to seal the bulkheads, tried to trap him inside, but he was already past them, already moving deeper, already erasing them before they could even breathe a word into their radios. Johnny wasn't just killing them. He was dismantling them. And every floor he cleared was another step closer to the president. The war room was silent as the sounds of the slaughter echoed through the emergency speakers. One by one, each security team sent to stop Johnny was wiped out. The president watched in horror as the body count climbed. His best soldiers, his last line of defense, were being butchered like nothing. Some of the men in the war room began to shake, their hands hovering over their sidearms, as if debating whether they should end it themselves before he arrived. Others prayed to gods they had forgotten. It didn't matter. They were already dead. The president clenched his fists, his knuckles white, as he turned to his remaining commanders. Send in the prime directive. They hesitated. Now. One of them scrambled to activate the final fail-safe, his trembling fingers dancing across the console. And somewhere, deep within the base, the last of the government's horrors awoke. The prime directive was never supposed to be unleashed. It was the last resort, the final project of a government desperate to keep its rule intact. An experiment so grotesque, so unnatural, that even the scientists who created it feared it. It had once been human. Once been a man, a soldier who had been reanimated, re-engineered, twisted into something that was no longer bound by the same rules as the undead before him. He could think. He could adapt. And he had been programmed with one command. Kill Johnny Vanjik. Johnny heard it before he saw it. A sound like cracking bones, like the shifting of something that should not exist. Then the walls began to shake. The bulkheads melted open, as something stepped through the steel as if it were nothing but paper. It was huge, standing nearly 9 feet tall, its flesh stitched together from countless bodies, its face a mosaic of horror, shifting and twitching as if multiple people were still trapped within it, screaming. Its eyes locked onto Johnny, and for the first time since the war began, something spoke to him first. "You are an anomaly." Johnny just smirked, spinning the cylinder on his .44 Magnum. "So are you." The creature moved first, faster than anything that size had the right to be. Johnny dodged, but the thing anticipated him, twisting in ways that weren't natural. The fight that followed was like something out of a nightmare. They moved through the corridors, through entire sections of the base, their battle-shattering steel, collapsing walls, sending waves of fire and debris into the darkness. Johnny fired round after round, but the thing refused to go down. It healed. It adapted. It was like nothing he had ever fought before. But Johnny didn't stop. Because he knew one thing the government never understood. They thought they could build something stronger than him. Something that could match him. But they were wrong. Johnny wasn't just strong. He was relentless. And when the fight reached its peak, when the creature made its final mistake, Johnny saw the opening. The last bullet in the chamber, aimed directly into the shifting, pulsating mass of horror where its heart should have been. Johnny pulled the trigger, and the prime directive died screaming. The war room was silent, save for the flickering of broken monitors and the distant echoes of alarms blaring somewhere in the bowels of the underground fortress. The president sat frozen in his chair, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps as he stared at the figure standing before him. Johnny Vanjik. The man who had brought his empire to its knees. The man who had walked through flame and blood, who had slaughtered his way through an army, who had killed everything the government had thrown at him and still kept moving. The last standing nightmare of the rebellion. And he was here, now, standing no more than 10 feet away. The president's hand twitched toward his desk drawer, reaching for the sidearm he kept hidden inside. But before his fingers even touched the handle, he heard the click. Johnny had already cocked the hammer back on his .44 Magnum. The president swallowed hard, his entire body trembling. Johnny just stared at him. Those glowing eyes, cold and unreadable, cutting through the dim emergency lights like twin lanterns in the dark. For the first time in his long, wretched life, the president finally understood what fear was. "You're afraid." Johnny's voice was low, almost casual. The president stiffened, forcing himself to straighten up in his chair. His pride, his ego, everything he had built over centuries of rule, it was still screaming inside of him, telling him that he could turn this around, that he could escape, that he was still in control. But he wasn't. Not anymore. Not since the moment he had decided to enslave Lancaster County. Not since the moment he had unleashed this war upon the world. Not since the moment he had crossed the wrong man. The president licked his lips, his throat dry as dust. You think you've won? Johnny tilted his head slightly, amused. Haven't I? The president bared his teeth in something that was meant to be a sneer, but it looked too much like fear. Even if you kill me, my forces will. Johnny shot him in the leg. The sound thundered through the room, the bullet ripping through bone and flesh, slamming the president back against his chair with a choke scream. His hands grasped at his ruined leg, blood spilling through his fingers as he gasped, eyes wide in shock. Johnny took one step closer. "You talk too much," he muttered. The president clutched his leg, his breath coming in frantic, ragged bursts. You can't kill me," he wheezed, his face pale, his body shaking with adrenaline and agony. "If you do, there'll be chaos. The government will." Johnny shot him in the other leg. The president let out another scream, his body jerking violently as the second bullet shattered his kneecap. His hands clawed at the table, his body writhing in pain as he tried to crawl away, but there was nowhere to go. Johnny let him suffer for a moment. Watched as he struggled, gasped, whimpered. Watched as the reality of it all finally hit him. Then, slowly, he crouched down, his face just inches from the president's. "You still think you're in charge, don't you?" The president gritted his teeth, forcing himself to glare up at Johnny through the pain. I've ruled this world for centuries. I built something that..." Johnny grabbed the back of his head and slammed it against the desk. The president let out a strangled gasp as his vision exploded into white-hot agony. "You built nothing," Johnny said, his voice calm, deadly, certain. "You stole. You enslaved. You twisted the dead into your own personal army because you were too weak to fight your own battles." Johnny let go, watching as the president slumped forward, gasping, his blood dripping onto the metal floor. "You ruled with fear," Johnny continued, standing back up. "But fear only works when people have something to lose." The president let out a wheezing chuckle, spitting blood onto the table. "You think you're different." He lifted his head, his lips curled in something like defiance. "You're no hero, Vanjik. You're just another killer." Johnny smiled. "Yeah," he said simply. "But the difference between me and you..." The president blinked. Johnny pressed the barrel of the .44 Magnum against his forehead. "I never pretended I was anything else." The gun fired. The president's body jerked violently once, then slumped back against the chair, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. For a long moment, the war room was silent. Then, Johnny exhaled, flicking the casing out of his revolver. It hit the floor with a soft clink. And just like that, it was over. The undead empire had no leader. No more chains, no more government, no more war machine holding the world in its grip. It was done. Johnny stared at the corpse for a long moment before he holstered his gun. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. There was nothing left to do here. Outside, the world was still burning, still shifting, still struggling to figure out what came next. That wasn't his problem. He had never wanted to rule. Never wanted power. He had come for one reason. And now it was time to go home. Johnny walked through the ruined halls of the underground fortress, his boots crunching against spent shell casings, broken glass, and the corpses of the last remnants of the undead empire. Smoke curled from fires still burning in the wreckage, and the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions echoed through the base, the last, desperate attempts of loyalists clinging to a cause that had already died. But he wasn't stopping for them. He didn't need to. The rebels would handle the cleanup. The undead, his undead, would see to it that no one left this place still carrying the banner of the dead empire. Johnny had done his part. He had taken the head of the beast. The rest of the world would decide what to do with the carcass. The elevator leading to the surface was long gone, destroyed in the chaos of the invasion. That didn't matter. Johnny knew another way. He moved through the wreckage like a man walking home after a long shift, unbothered by the destruction, unfazed by the bodies around him. The war was over. That thought should have meant something. For the first time in centuries, the government was gone. The thing that had ruled the world with fear and death was nothing but ashes. And yet, Johnny didn't feel satisfaction. He just felt tired. The tunnels leading out of the fortress were still partially intact, though the walls were lined with crawling shadows, dying embers, and the distant echoes of things best left behind. These passageways had been used by officers and high-ranking government officials, escape routes meant to ensure they could flee and rebuild if the empire ever fell. Johnny made sure none of them got that chance. He stepped over the bodies of cowards who had tried to run, their faces frozen in expressions of disbelief, of terror, of confusion at how this was possible. How the empire had fallen. How the invincible undead had been beaten. They had spent too long believing themselves gods to understand how fragile they truly were. That was their problem. Not his. He emerged from the tunnels onto the surface of Texas, where the sky was a swirling mass of smoke and stars, the fires of battle still smoldering on the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a wasteland that had once been the heart of American control. Now it was just a graveyard. Behind him, the fortress was collapsing, explosions ripping through the underground levels as the last self-destruct sequences activated, consuming the ruins in fire. Johnny didn't turn around. He just kept walking. He could hear distant shouting, distant victory cries from the rebels who had fought their way inside, who had seen the body of the president with their own eyes. He could hear them calling his name. But he didn't stop. Didn't respond. Because he was done. Days passed. The world changed. It happened slowly, in small moments at first. The rebels formally declared victory. The remaining government loyalists were rounded up, executed, or sent into hiding. The undead, now leaderless, now no longer bound to the will of the old empire, simply stopped. Some wandered, lost, waiting for Johnny's final promise to them. Others fought, reclaiming their own will for the first time in centuries, no longer shackled by government commands. The living didn't know what to do with them. But Johnny did. He spent weeks traveling, moving across the old empire, finding the last of the undead, gathering them together, making sure they knew what was coming. He had promised them freedom. And that didn't mean letting them rot in what remained of the world. No. They were going to be cured. That had always been the deal. By the time he reached Lancaster County, the world had already started to rebuild. Cities were rising again, no longer under the shadow of the dead empire. People were trying to find their own way forward, their own future. Johnny had no part in it. He didn't want one. Lancaster was still standing, battered but unbroken, a place that had refused to die even when the world had tried to crush it. Johnny stepped into the quiet streets, letting out a slow breath. This place had once been the epicenter of resistance, the spark that had ignited a war, the first sign that the empire was not invincible. Now, it was just home. He moved through the streets, hands in his pockets, passing by people who had no idea what he had done, what he had been. That was fine. He didn't need them to know. He was done being the Duke. Now, he was just Johnny Vanjik again. And that was more than enough. It began with one. A single undead, a man who had died centuries ago, reanimated against his will, forced to walk the earth in servitude to an empire that had never let him rest. He stood in the middle of a ruined city, his rotting flesh still covered in the remnants of his old uniform, staring at the figure before him, the one who had set him free. Johnny Vanjik. The promise had been made. And now, it was time to keep it. Johnny raised his hand, his fingers pressing against the undead's forehead. A pulse of something unseen rippled through the air, a low hum vibrating in the space between them. The undead didn't resist. He had no reason to. For the first time since his body had been stolen, since his mind had been locked away in the hunger, he felt peace. And then, his body crumbled away, the decay reversing itself, the rot peeling away in strands of light and dust. His bones cracked, reforming, his flesh becoming whole again. And then, standing where the monster had once been, was a man. His breath hitched. His hands trembled. He fell to his knees, gasping, feeling his heart beat again for the first time in centuries. Tears spilled down his face as he touched his own skin, no longer gray, no longer decayed. And then he laughed. A broken, choked, disbelieving laugh. Because he was alive. The first of many. The process spread across the world, one by one. Johnny moved through the ruins of the old empire, through the places where the undead had been left behind, where they had been abandoned once the government fell. Some were hostile at first, lost in the remnants of their old hunger, too consumed by rage and confusion to understand what was happening. But Johnny didn't fight them. He simply waited. Waited until they saw what he had done to the others. Waited until they realized they had another choice. And when they stepped forward, when they let go of the hate that had been burned into them for centuries, he freed them. One by one, they were restored. The warriors. The civilians. The countless people who had been turned into weapons, who had been trapped in bodies that no longer belonged to them. They were given back their lives. It didn't matter if they had been dead for a decade or 1,000 years. The process worked all the same. Some fell to the ground and wept. Some stared at the sky for the first time with human eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun against real skin, not rotting flesh. Some just held each other, unsure if it was real. But it was. And Johnny just kept going. Because there was no rest until every last one of them was free. By the time the last undead was cured, the world had changed forever. There were no more monsters roaming the earth. No more abominations stitched together in government labs. No more walking weapons of war. For the first time in centuries, the dead were truly dead. And the living? They could finally live again. Johnny stood at the edge of a quiet field, watching the last lingering traces of the old world fade away. The final cured soul stood beside him, a woman who had once been nothing but another government experiment, her body twisted and broken beyond recognition. Now, she was whole. She looked at Johnny, her expression unreadable. "You really did it," she whispered. Johnny didn't say anything. He just nodded, turning his gaze toward the horizon. It was over. The war. The empire. The curse. All of it. The world had spent centuries under the boot of the undead empire, its borders redrawn in blood, its people ruled by fear. When the government fell, when Johnny cured the last of the undead, there was no immediate peace, only silence. For the first time in generations, there was no one commanding the world from a throne of corpses. No one issuing orders from the shadows, no one enforcing control with the threat of the undead. It was a world without a master. And in that silence, the people had a choice. Rebuild or fall into chaos. The first few months were uncertain. The war had left entire nations in ruin, cities reduced to rubble, governments shattered beyond recognition. But something unexpected happened. The world didn't collapse. People didn't turn on each other. They had seen what division had done. They had spent too long being told they needed to be ruled, that they were weak, that they couldn't survive without the empire's control. And now, with that empire gone, they finally proved the opposite. Leaders began to rise not from old power, not from inherited rule, but from the people themselves. They gathered in the ruins of once great capitals, sitting in halls made from what was left of the old world, discussing the future, not just for themselves, but for everyone. Because for the first time in centuries, borders mattered again. North America. The United States as it had once existed was gone. What remained were fractured states, still reeling from the war, still trying to decide what came next. The original 13 colonies, now called the Free States, formed a new government, one built on the foundation of what had been stolen from them. Pennsylvania, the birthplace of the rebellion, was the new center of power. The Midwest, once the heart of the government's military production, was now a neutral zone, its people electing to live without a single ruling body, forming city-states that governed themselves. The South was in chaos, torn between rebuilding and facing the reality that much of their infrastructure had been dependent on the old empire. And as for South America, the last stronghold of the old government, it had severed itself completely. They wanted no part of the Free States, no part of the rebellion. They would rebuild on their own terms. And the Free States? They let them. Because this was not a world of conquest anymore. It was a world of reclamation. Europe. Europe had suffered the longest under the undead empire. Its cities had been battlegrounds. Its people had been enslaved, drained for resources, used as experiments in the government's horrific search for new weapons. But when the war ended, Europe was the first to heal. France, Spain, and Germany came together immediately, forming the first international alliance, dedicated to rebuilding what had been lost. The United Kingdom, or what was left of it, was slowly repopulated. The government had erased it from existence, but with the undead gone, people began to return to the land that had been left behind. London was rebuilt brick by brick, its people starting over from nothing. For the first time since the empire took control, Europe belonged to itself again. Asia and Russia. China and Russia had been wild cards during the war. They had fought not for conquest, not for ideology, but for survival. When the empire collapsed, they wasted no time reclaiming their sovereignty. They restored their governments, rebuilt their infrastructure, and refused to let themselves be dragged into the politics of the West. Japan thrived, its cities already functioning before the war had even ended. India, once a crucial part of the global rebellion, took its place as one of the most powerful nations in the New World. Borders were redrawn, not with war, but through negotiation. For the first time in centuries, peace was an option. The world moves on. By the third year after the fall of the undead empire, the world had begun to resemble what it once was. It was not perfect, Scars from the war still remained. Entire cities would never recover. There were still divisions, still tensions, still wounds that would take generations to heal. But people were living again. And that was what mattered. For the first time in centuries, the world wasn't fighting to survive. It was fighting to live. And somewhere, in a quiet place far from the chaos, Johnny Vanjik watched it all happen. He had fought not for power, not for a throne, not for recognition. He had fought because it needed to be done. And now, as the world rebuilt itself, as the borders were redrawn with ink instead of blood, as people chose their own futures for the first time in centuries, he knew it had all been worth it. Even if no one ever knew his name. Lancaster County had suffered more than most. It had been the first battleground, the first place where the government's iron grip had been tested and found wanting. It had been enslaved, beaten down, made an example of, its people branded third-class citizens, forced to live under the boot of a regime that saw them as less than human. And yet, it had survived. When the government fell, when the undead were freed, when the world took its first breath as something other than a battlefield, Lancaster stood tall. It had not been erased. It had not been forgotten. It had endured. And now, it was healing. The farmlands were the first to return. Fields that had once been left to rot under government rule, turned into resource zones for military production, were now green again. The land, as if knowing that its people had finally been freed, came back to life. Farmers returned, planting seeds not for war, but for food. Crops sprouted in the soil where blood had once soaked the earth. The people who had once been labeled as slaves, as expendable, as nothing more than tools for the government's machine, were now the masters of their own land again. Lancaster was thriving. The city itself had changed. It had once been a prison, a place where people were watched, monitored, controlled. Where patrols had walked the streets, ensuring that no one stepped out of line. Now, those streets were filled with life. Buildings that had once been bombed out ruins were rebuilt, their facades repaired, their windows no longer shattered by gunfire. Markets opened in the squares. Children ran through the streets without fear. There were no checkpoints, no armed patrols, no soldiers in black armor scanning the crowds for threats. People were free. And they were learning how to live again. The old government buildings had been burned to the ground. No one wanted to keep them standing. In their place, Lancaster built something new. A place for its people, by its people. A council formed not a government, not a ruling body, but a group of leaders chosen from the community, people who had survived the worst, people who would never allow Lancaster to be enslaved again. There were no presidents here. No dictators. No kings. Only Lancaster. Only the people who had fought to keep it alive. And Johnny. He watched it all from a distance. He sat on the edge of town, where the land stretched out wide and open, where the wind carried the smell of growing crops and fresh rain. He had no place in the new council. He had no title, no monument, no legacy carved in stone. And that was exactly how he wanted it. He wasn't a ruler. He wasn't a leader. He had fought so that others could have a future, not so that he could shape it himself. And now, that future was happening. He could see it in the way the people smiled, in the way they walked through the streets without fear, in the way they spoke without whispering. They didn't need him anymore. That was the best outcome he could have asked for. He leaned back in the grass, his hat pulled low over his eyes, the sun warm on his skin. Lancaster was free. And for the first time in a long, long time. So was he. As Johnny sat there, eyes half closed beneath the golden glow of the Lancaster sunset, he felt it. A shift in the air. A presence that was both familiar and unknown, something he had felt before but had never truly faced. And when he opened his eyes, he saw them. Standing in the field beyond the city, past the farmlands that had reclaimed their beauty, past the ruins that had been rebuilt into homes, they stood figures like him, yet not. Other Vanjikis. Some wore dusters, black and flowing in the wind, their eyes burning with the same golden glow as his own. Some stood wrapped in futuristic armor, the symbols of wars yet to come etched into their gear, holding weapons from worlds that had never existed in this timeline. Some were more monstrous than men, their forms twisted, half shadow, half wraith, battle-worn from wars fought beyond the reach of time. And yet, they were all him. From the era of the imposter, where the false storyteller tried to rewrite the truth itself, to the days before the call sign network was even spoken into existence, to the shattered futures beyond the multiversal war, where worlds burned and were rebuilt, where time fractured and reforged itself in the fire of untold battles. The Vanjikis were always there. And they always would be. Johnny stood, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his revolver, though he knew this was no fight. This was something else. Something bigger. One of them stepped forward, a version of him wearing a long, battle-scarred coat, its edges burned as if he had walked through hell itself. His eyes glowed like embers in the dark, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 battles fought across 1,000 timelines. "You know what comes next," the other Johnny said. Johnny exhaled slowly, tilting his head. "Do I?" "You do," another voice said, this one deeper, heavier, coming from a Vanjik in sleek black armor, the insignia of a war not yet fought gleaming on his chest. Johnny didn't speak. Didn't need to. Because he understood. This world had been saved. But there were so many more. So many nightmares still clawing at the edges of reality. So many false kings, so many broken empires, so many would-be tyrants who thought they could rewrite the story in their own image. And they were wrong. Because the Vanjikis were always here. They had always been here. And they always would be. You ready? One of them asked. Johnny rolled his shoulders, adjusting his hat, a slow grin pulling at his lips. Don't know why you're a skin, he said. You already know the answer. And just like that they stepped into the void. The multiverse stretched before them, a vast and endless expanse of worlds in need of saving, of timelines screaming for justice, of horrors that had never known fear. Until now. Because the Vanjikis had returned. And this time, they were here to make the nightmares afraid of the dark.